Hello, everybody, and welcome to what is the third session in a new monthly series of Global Connections, where we get experts to come and help us talk about and think about some of the big macro issues that are facing global policymakers. And last month, we had Jason Furman and Kim Klausing speaking about taxation of capital globally. In December, Larry Summers and Laurence Boone were speaking about fiscal policy. And then today, we're very lucky to have Diane Coyle and Reinhilde Veugelers to talk about tech, some of the big issues that face policymakers, grappling with calls from citizens and politicians to regulate and deal with big tech. And are there ways that the global system should be thinking of introducing rules of the road? And just a little background on each of them. Diane Coyle is well known, I think, in this field. She worked with Jason Furman on a paper that gave advice to the UK government on how to regulate big tech, or Diane can explain that more. She's currently the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at Cambridge University. And we also have Reinhilde Veugelers, who is connected to Peterson Institute because she is a senior fellow there, and is also professor at Leuven University and is a senior fellow at Bruegel as well as at Peterson. And Reinhilde in particular has done a lot of work on innovation. And of course, that's the flip side. The big companies will argue that too much regulation will stifle innovation. And in Europe, there has tended to be more of a focus on the need to regulate and have a regime for big tech companies. And this is quite topical because just now there is a lot of discussion in Europe on two pieces of legislation, the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, the first of which aims to put in place rules to promote competition, and the second is around consumer protection and transparency. And I just want to start out, I'm going to start out with asking Reinhilde to talk to us a bit about the lay of the land in Europe, but I want to set up in advance the idea that the two big countries that have big tech companies are the US and China, and not Europe. And I was just seeing from a piece put out today by Lisbon Council President that of the top 15 tech companies, they're all either American or Chinese. And of the top 200, only 8 come from Europe or a European. And I think that in Europe, that is frustrating. But there's a question about whether it matters for European growth and innovation. These are global companies. Does it matter where they're headquartered? And then there's also a question about, well, why is that the case? What is, if you like, wrong with Europe that has been so successful on a manufacturing and other ways of innovating? So I'm going to turn first to Reinhilde to give us a bit of the lay of the land in Europe, and particularly focusing on how we think about innovation. Oh, I'm sorry. Before you do, Reinhilde, I should just say for everybody listening that we will very much welcome your comments. We're going to begin with a little bit of commentary by Reinhilde and Diane, and then some questions that I will put to them. But we would love to have questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function and not the chat, because we can all see the Q&A function. I don't think you can, but we, the panelists and I, can see the Q&A, and that would be a great way to put your questions in. Thanks. Over to Reinhilde.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Carolyn. I'm very happy to be here, to be able to talk about innovation and digital, because it's something that's very close to my heart. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion here. So I'd like to, as Carolyn was saying, open a bit the floor for showing the landscape of innovation and digital technologies here. So first important point I want to make is how important innovation is for digital firms and sectors. First of all, digital technologies offer a lot of opportunities for technological change. The frontier is really moving, and it's moving very fast. We also see that that the digital companies have a very high R&D intensity. So, they spend substantially on innovation. And the leading firms in the sector are all also leading innovators, which really shows that innovation is really an important part for market leadership here. And it's actually it's important for incumbent firms, innovation, to keep their leadership, but it's even more important for new players, because we see that new players in the sector can only enter if they really have strong innovative advantages, coming up with new technological settings here. So innovation is really important for the digital sector. Vice versa, actually also. So the digital sector and digital technologies have become very important for the innovation landscape. So while we used to have, if you look at the leading innovators, there were companies like Volkswagen, like big health companies, energy companies, those were the leading innovators. Well, actually now, if you look at the tracing of the world leading innovators, those who spend on R&D, out of the 7 biggest, 6 are the digital companies. There is only 1 remaining, that's Volkswagen, in this top 7 here. So the digital landscape also really determines the innovation landscape. And also in these classic non-digital sectors, the use of digital technologies is becoming increasingly important for them to maintain their positions here. So if you think of Volkswagen or automobile producers, it's really how well they adapt and adopt digital technologies that determines their current leadership here. And the same also holds for energy companies and for big health as well here. So overall, I think I made the case how important it is to look at innovation. It's a critical dimension, both to understand the digital sectors here, but also in the adoption of digital technologies in other sectors here. And then it really matters to understand better how the digital innovation machine works best because of its serious impact it has on overall. And then if we look at how to make that digital innovation machine work best, there are 2 important dimensions to look at. Dimensions of market competition, is there enough competition, and also firm size. How much competition do we need for a functioning digital innovation sector? Of course, economists as usual, they say it all depends. So on the one hand, you need competition as an incentive for firms to innovate because they want to escape the competition, and also to protect them from new entrants. So you need enough competition as an incentive, particularly for incumbent firms. But on the other hand, you also need to have enough market power or rents as an incentive for innovation. So it can also not be too much competition here. So, and we know this in economics, the non-linearity between the relationship between competition and innovation is not an easy one, and it will require really a very careful look at the sectors involved. With respect to the dimension of size and scale, is big beautiful? Do we need big companies for digital innovation? Again, a two-handed answer. On the one hand, yes, for innovation, there could be scale economies. It's important to be big. But on the other hand, path dependencies and fear of cannibalization of your own existing profits may actually trap big incumbent firms here and may give an advantage to new, smaller entrants here, particularly for radical innovation. So also for size, the relationship is not so obvious here. So then there is a very heavy discussion also on, are there any winner-take-all dynamics in digital innovations? And if there are these winner-take-all dynamics, is that good or bad for innovation? And that's a bit combining incumbent and size advantages here. So are there winner-take-all dynamics? Again, two-handed answer. So on the one hand, yes, there clearly are advantages for bigger firms, economies of scale and scope for innovation, particularly in the platform-based part of digital sectors here, coming from the two-sided network effects, which require larger use base and larger base of applications and equipments here. So size definitely matter. Also, scope and scale advantages from data collection and analysis give a big advantage for larger firms to innovate here. Yet the bargaining power within platforms for small new developers may still be very important. good if they bring unique new ideas to those platforms here, but that all depends on how open and compatible these platforms are, how strong their bargaining power will actually be. In terms of incumbency advantage, also very strong advantages, again, particularly in platform-based digital sectors here, because if you combine these two-sided networks with large switching costs, then it creates a large barrier of entry for new entrants and a big advantage for incumbency here. And particularly for innovation, where incumbency could also be an advantage, is because a lot of innovation is actually really not completely new, but it's for making new combinations among existing components. What Hall Varian also called the combinatorial innovation. And that means the more components you already have, the more new combinations you will also be making here. So that gives some advantage of those that have these new combinations, and again, creates an advantage for incumbency here. But nevertheless, we're talking about innovation. Technology changes very rapidly here, and incumbent advantages may also be very quickly depreciated, and particularly in this sector, as the speed of technological change really goes fast and the frontier shifts very fast here. So that means that that new knowledge components or new ways to combine are also an important part of innovation here, and that may be something that new entrants will actually typically be doing here much more, and with those new knowledge can actually surpass existing entry barriers here. So that still leaves a lot of room also for new players here. And another element that needs to take into account is the speed with which the existing knowledge actually diffuses and spills over to others and can be used by others. Which leads to catching up and dissipating of previous leadership positions here. So knowledge very quickly dissipates and can be used also by others. And the faster that happens, the faster there will actually be catch up here. And then, of course, incumbents may particularly be trapped if they are slow adopters of all these new technologies here. So again, it's not so clear how strong these incumbency advantages are, particularly in a fast evolving field as digital technologies here. So that's why it's important to look at the data and to see it can go either way. Well, let's see what the data tell us. And in that respect, if we look indeed at the concentration of the innovation of digital firms, what we see it's highly concentrated in few firms, but that's very normal because that happens in every sector. There is always a lot of concentration in all sectors. And so in that respect, digital sectors are not special in the sense that they would be more concentrated. On the contrary, so they actually are a little bit less concentrated than, for instance, if you think of the health sector or in car manufacturing. So digital sectors are concentrated, but not excessively more than in other sectors here. There is a very strong incumbency advantage, but again, that's very normal. You see that in every sector that incumbent innovators have strong advantages. That also holds for digital, and actually it holds somewhat less for digital. It's still high incumbency advantages, but it holds a bit less than in other sectors like in health and in car manufacturing here. And it also, so it dissipates faster. So there is much more turbulence among the leadership as well. So it's much more easy in the digital sectors to have new top players here. But again, size matters, incumbency advantage matters, but there is much more turbulence than in other sectors here. If you look at the position of the EU, and we'll come back to that when we're discussing the EU specifics here, the EU is well represented as a home base for persistent R&D leaders, but in vehicles, in car manufacturing and in biopharma, they completely missed the digital here and have also, despite the turbulence that there is, this turbulence comes from other US companies or from Chinese companies, not from European ones here. So in that respect, I think we do need to look at the specifics of digital sectors, case by case actually, because it's not very clear whether there is any way concentration among big tech here and persistency here, but there are clearly also indications that there are advantages here and that needs to be taken carefully into account. Also, what's very important, not only how do these main big tech leaders operate in terms of innovation. What about business dynamics? How easy is it for new companies to enter into these leading positions in the digital sector here? And there we do see that the entry and exit rates of business, of course they were important, but they have actually decreased somewhat over time, these business dynamics, and that decline is stronger in digital sectors than in other sectors. So again, kind of warning point here. That also ties a bit to the discussion on killer acquisitions, where entrants are acquired by incumbents, where they shelve disruptive innovations, and could also create killer zones where other non-taken over entrants are disincentivized here. So definitely there is, although the evidence there is again not clear, there is something that definitely needs to be carefully monitored here. And then in terms of the diffusion of digital technologies, so how fast is that diffusion of technologies taking place? The evidence is also so there is adoption of technologies, but that adoption of technologies is very polarized. So you do have companies in other sectors that are very fast in adopting, but you have also others which are lagging behind. And we see from our own analysis that the digital divide is actually increasing, in the sense that the ones that are not adopting are also don't have any plans to continue adopting here, and it's the ones that are already adopting that forge ahead here. Remains to be seen whether the COVID crisis has actually been a shift for catching up for the ones that were lagging behind, but the evidence so far, the more recent evidence, still seems to suggest it's mostly the ones that were already active that forge ahead, but that the ones that were not active also are not catching up. So there is also on the diffusion side an issue to carefully look at this here. So I think that's a bit setting the scene here, and I think it really means that for innovation policy, we will need to look at size and particularly competition policy as an important instrument for innovation. And on the competition policy side, I think innovation should be way more larger on the mindset of competition policy authorities here. So really taking into account much more the specifics of innovation that requires risk-taking, uncertainty, rather than verifiability of effects here, and that it also requires much more science and technology know-how on the digital sector at competition policy authorities as well. But we will go further into the details of the policy questions later. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Reinhilde. That was terrific and really laid out. As you said, there are two different views, but I think part of what it suggested was that it is important to have a balance, and it's perhaps very difficult for policymakers in such a fast-moving field, although the field hasn't moved so fast recently because over a number of years we've had a few companies that have tended to dominate, a few big tech companies. I want just to let everybody know, and you may already know this, but we've been used in the US and maybe in Europe to thinking about the 5 big tech companies and tracking them in particular. They've done particularly well in the US stock market, and that's one reason why the US stock market has gone up so much in the past during the pandemic, despite what's happened to the real economy. Same is true in China, and obviously not in Europe, because you don't have those big companies. However, just recently, the extraordinary rise in the stock price of Tesla, which is obviously a digital company, but also a manufacturing company, an auto company, has risen so much that it's pushed Facebook out of the big 5. So that just struck me as an interesting dynamic, because it's been a while since there's been a challenge to, or at least a shift in those top 5. So I want to turn now to Diane, who has looked at these issues very carefully, particularly from the point of view of the United Kingdom, and on competition, but also on, I don't know that it's more subtle, but some of the complicated questions about harmful content, which I think are viewed very differently, and privacy in different countries. And in the US, there's obviously traditionally been the First Amendment and a great sense that you should just sort of let the internet, let people be who they are and write what they want to write on the internet. And the internet companies, social media companies, very keen to say, we're not publishers, we can't control it. And we've seen in the wake of the January 6th storming of the Capitol building here, and a lot of concern also about a rather different issue on misinformation about vaccine because of the great global threat of the pandemic, that the companies, at least in the US, have moved much more rapidly, with Twitter banning former President Trump, but a whole lot of his followers as well. And then just recently, Facebook announcing that they are going to get rid of or stifle arguments that are questioning vaccinations, especially the COVID vaccination, but also others. And this really does, I think the EU had some language about there are private rule makers that exert power rather than governments. And I think there is a big question, do we want the private rule makers to be making rules that address problems, societal problems of harmful content? Or is that not their business and therefore we should have government rules or rules of the road at least? So over to you, Diane. I'm looking forward to hearing your take on these issues. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and greetings from a very chilly Cambridge in the UK. Reinhilde has done a fantastic job setting out the issues for us. So I thought I'd go a little bit more into the policy questions by setting out the lay of the land here in the UK. I was a member of the panel that Jason Furman chaired that gave advice to the UK government. And we saw what we were advising as very much making competition work better, making the markets work better, because these are very highly valued services that the companies provide. They have been very innovative. They are, as Reinhilde said, in markets where there are lots of winner-take-all dynamics. So you wouldn't be surprised to see one or two large companies dominating a part of the market. And so the issue is competition for the market in the jargon of economics, not in the market. And I can assure you that innovation is very much a part of that thinking. What we recommended is being implemented by the government here. And there are two or three key points. One is to say that certain companies would be designated with strategic market status. So the big companies that we all think about would be among those, but probably not more than a handful altogether. They would have a mandatory code of practice that would develop behaviors around what kinds of terms and conditions they set, what kind of consent they get, how they change their APIs and what notice they give, self-preferencing and so on. So all of the issues that have come up in competition cases. And we would expect that this kind of code of conduct, code of practice would spread outside the strategic market status companies. They would have to notify acquisitions and they would all be scrutinized much more carefully than in the past. They have been very acquisitive companies and they buy a lot of their innovation, either to shelve it or to use it themselves. And we also put a lot of focus on data interoperability because using the data is one of the key things that will enable further innovation, not just by the big companies themselves, but by others too. The digital markets unit that we recommended is being set up in the Competition and Markets Authority. It will have technical expertise and it will coordinate all the other regulators. There's some other competition issues that are being talked about in these circles now, such as algorithmic collusion and protection for labour on gig platforms and so on. But I think the digital market unit will cover the key Furman review issues. It's interesting to me that competition has come to be seen as such an important policy tool in the EU, and the UK, Australia, now in the US as well. Because market power is really only one of the issues that arises with regard to the big tech companies. And so, Caroline, you just touched on one of the others about online harms. Here in the UK, we have legislation due. There's been consultation on some proposals. And what's proposed is fines of up to 10% of annual global turnover on big companies in particular, but a sort of tiered system of expecting companies to remove harmful content very quickly. And in areas where I think there would be a lot of consensus about harms, such as child pornography or incitement to violence and so on. And there are specific exemptions to safeguard journalism. So we don't have the First Amendment, but we do take very seriously the ability of a free press and free protest. And the regulator there would be Ofcom, which is responsible for broadcast media and telecommunications regulation and has very long experience in content regulation issues. I think other countries will follow. There's an 80% majority in UK polls for taking action to limit harmful content, and it's a toxic issue everywhere. So I'm on the side of this debate that says the big companies themselves should not be the rule makers here, and they have been too lax in what they allow on the platforms. It has been incredibly harmful in a number of areas. And then the third area I wanted to highlight was data and privacy. So we have a consultation at the moment on a national data strategy. A lot of the focus on that is on things like technical standards, interoperability, the skills base for using data. You know, as Reinhilde was saying, there's a gap emerging between companies that do use data well and they're becoming more innovative and productive, and those that are finding it very hard to do so. And one of the key elements of the data strategy document is about being able to access data for innovation and growth. So it links very directly to that innovation agenda. And this means thinking in some detail about how do you share data, what data should be accessed, and what are the rights that people have over their own data and how it's used, and what are the benefits to end users. And it seems to me that there's quite a lot further to go in terms of understanding the detail and the implications of the data economy. And it's an area with my own research at the moment. I think it's very interesting. My view is that we focus too much on individual rights. Privacy is obviously very important, and we all care about, there are things that all of us want others not to know about. But I think it's a mistake to see data as something that we own and something that's an individual right, because it's all relational. And even if I consent to some aspect of my personal data being used, that has information about other people too, to the extent that they're like me. Information that I might consider very private, such as health information, is only useful to the extent that I understand the population data, so I depend on other people's data as well. And I'm concerned that we would foreclose opportunities for innovation and social benefit if we don't figure out rules that will enable more data sharing and data combining. This is really important for future innovation and growth. AI is going to be important, the use of data is going to be important. There's something of an arms race emerging. I think we're already seeing a splitting up into different data universes because of data localization rules. And this seems to me need thinking about very carefully, because for many countries who are not cloud infrastructure owners and operators and don't have the AI capabilities that are now being made available through that cloud infrastructure very easily and relatively cheaply, then having to keep data onshore, as it were, is going to be harmful and not helpful. And so I think we've already seen a certain amount of balkanization of the internet and more national governments deciding that they want to shut things off. I guess the most recent example is in Burma. But for the US and EU and now the UK as a separate entity from the EU and other jurisdictions such as Canada or Australia, I think some really careful thought needs to be given about data rules and the data economy. And this will, to some extent, be national, and certainly online harms. It's a national, it's a democratic issue. Different polities need to decide the boundaries there for themselves. But for data, I think there's a great need for international cooperation here. And the more we can have international standards, such as GSM, creating the mobile telephony market and the scale that that brought to providers everywhere, we need a similar kind of conversation about the data economy, the standards and the rules that we're going to set ourselves. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope that's taken us into some of the policy questions that you want to cover, Caroline.
Yes, thanks. That was terrific. And I thought it was interesting the way you pointed to the fact that, yes, competition is an important issue, and that's linked very much, as Reinhilde was explaining, with innovation, but it's not the only issue that arises for policymakers. And you mentioned about, it seemed to me that you drew a distinction between harm or between market failures that should be addressed nationally or harms that should be addressed nationally because of cultural differences maybe, and you were saying that about what happens with what sort of content is appropriate, and other issues that are perhaps you need global rules of the road. And I'd be interested in hearing from you and then from Reinhilde about what scope you do see for international cooperation on developing rules of the road. And is that something that, you know, sometimes people talk about the G20 or the G7, or should there be a group of democracies, or obviously within Europe, there's a focus on the EU, but I think that, and to some extent the UN is involved, which is even harder to think of how you end up with agreed rules. So I'd be interested, Diane, in whether it makes sense to try to delineate some areas that are really for global policymakers. I mean, perhaps in the issue you mentioned of data transfer and data localization and borders it onto trade, and others that really are not going to be susceptible to international rules of the road.
So I think to the extent we can get international cooperation, the better it will be for everybody, because it reduces the regulatory burden on business, it enables common standards. The more you have common standards, the more you can grow markets. And so I just very briefly mentioned the example of mobile telephony in the GSM standard. And the impact of that has been enormous, because it means that not only is it convenient for anybody, but the whole mass market that's enabled the spread of telephony and the internet and all of everything that's enabled in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, for example, has clearly been beneficial. So particularly in areas like technical standards, where it's happened with other technologies, I would hope that we can see that. But also, it's, you know, who wants to increase burdens on business just for the sake of it? We should hope to have cooperation. But then, as you're saying, I think there are areas where national governments will very properly have regard for their own cultures and the wishes of their own populations. I don't know that it's easy to do a strict delineation of those, but I guess we start with the global discussions and build out to the extent that we can. Be interested to hear what Reinhilde says.
Yes, and Reinhilde, maybe you can also comment on which global institutions or organizations are the best to start with. You know, I worked for President Obama as his Sherpa, so-called, in the G7 and the G20, and I found those useful places to push for political consensus on whether it was on climate or reaction to Ebola or other, and obviously economic policy, but then other organizations would do the detailed technical work. But sometimes you need to get the political buy-in at some level. But obviously the G20 now is, you know, contains countries with a lot of different views about some of these issues. There's China and the US, but also Russia and Brazil and European Union. So I'm not sure how much or where to start, where one could start with trying to build out some global rules of the road. Reinhilde.
Yeah, thanks for asking very difficult questions. So what would be the best design for this global coordination? I think what matters first of all is that you have something that would really be realistic in reaching a global consensus, and that means that there should be not too different preferences among these players here. So in that respect, if there are too many different preferences, and that could hold, like for instance, politically, but could also hold for citizens, like how much they care about privacy differs quite substantially. If that differs, then it's way more difficult to reach consensus. And so in that respect, the delineation of global will also depend on how sufficiently close the players will actually be in order to have a feasible global outcome. But I think from an innovation perspective, what really matters is, first of all, that it should be as large as possible, because we want a large market as possible for incentives for innovation. What's also important is that even if there would be specifics in terms of regulation, that at least there should be some interoperability. That's very important, so that it's easy for these if there are differences in standards, that companies can actually design their products to fit various standards. So that I think is very important. And what's also important for innovation is that the regulatory framework and the standards should be sufficiently stable over time, such that it can actually also be used as to stimulate new innovations that would be better able to deal with the different standards in a more efficient and technologically feasible fashion, including if the regulations would be different, if that could incite new technologies, new innovations to better satisfy these differences in regulation. That would really be important, but requires a lot of stability in the design of the regulation as well. I am a little bit worried that if it becomes too complicated, these standards, and if these standards are set and have a lot of influence of incumbents, existing technologies, that makes it much more difficult for particularly new innovative players here. And that's why I think another important dimension of regulations and how to do that globally is to make sure that they are sufficiently innovation open for not only for existing technologies, but keep their design open for any new kind of technology that could be arising here, and sufficiently stable over time that new innovators can actually respond to these innovations as well. That will be my take on this.
Thanks very much. And perhaps we can just drill down a little bit first on privacy and data sharing, and then I want to go back to competition. How much, and it's interesting what Diane was saying, that maybe there's too much focus, or there has been too much focus on personal privacy, personal information. I think that's something that, especially in some, or people have different attitudes to it in different culturally. Certainly I notice going between the US and the UK that in one way the US is sort of very open, but a lot of people are allowed to say a lot of things, including on the internet with the First Amendment. But there in the UK, by contrast, there are CCTV everywhere, and so pretty much everybody is being watched all the time in some way, in a way that would not, well, it may not be practical in the US because it's so big, but it would certainly be seen as and felt as some sort of move to a surveillance state, which obviously if you're in the UK, you don't feel like that. But how much is, or how important is it, and I'm going to go to Reinhilde first, to at least agree on what sort of data should be protected or not protected, and how much are the GDPR, which I think many countries are trying to, the General Data Protection Regulation of the European Union, put in place a few years ago. Some countries are just thinking, okay, we should just adopt that to make it easier to deal with Europe. And others are thinking that is, Rob Atkinson was writing the other day about a Canadian American, about how these sorts of rules would actually stifle innovation and make it harder for some consumer help on health, and Diane talked about the context of health information, and also make it trade more difficult. So Reinhilde, do you have a view on that and how to draw the line and respect people's cultural concerns?
Yeah, I also like to hear Diane on that, so I'll try to be short. So again, I like to take the angle of what's the implication of regulation on privacy like GDPR for innovation here. So of course, privacy to the extent that this is a demand from society that needs to be satisfied. That's characteristics of the demands that we need to supply. But the question is how to best supply that and also make sure that we keep the innovation machine sufficiently well functioning so that it delivers this privacy at the most efficient mechanisms possible and with the best technologies possible here. And in that respect, I do think it's also very important that any kind of privacy regulation should really pass the test of, is it innovation proof? So does it allow, also, is it just designed now for existing technologies, or does it also, is it sufficiently designed so that it would allow new innovations, new technological solutions to arrive, which technology solutions which could actually be much better addressing privacy and serving new innovations without jeopardizing any privacy concerns here. And in that respect, I think like Diane already pointed out to, what we need to look at way more is this data also available for innovations and for new innovators that want to use these data here, while still properly reflecting privacy concerns of individuals. And there are technological solutions possible that allow for this use of data for new innovations while still respecting privacy concerns here. So let's also use the innovation machine to better be able to satisfy privacy concerns here without killing the scope for innovation here.
Thanks. So Diane.
I agree to a large extent with that. The key point for me is that privacy does not mean not sharing your data. So for example, I have a smart thermometer. I don't want people to know when I've turned the temperature up because it will tell them when I'm out of the house. I want that information to be kept private. But I also want that information to be shared so that the energy around the grid can be managed more efficiently. So they're two different concepts, and I think they have been merged in an unhelpful way in GDPR. And although the legislation formally allows quite a lot of uses of data, it's actually, I think it has had a chilling effect, and that's a bit unfortunate because it's framed data as a kind of personal property right, and I don't think that's at all how it operates. But it's there now, and we have to work with it, and anybody who wants to sell and operate in the European market is going to have to work with it. So I hope that as time goes by, people do become more able to use data for all of the fantastic innovations that might be possible as people come up with great new ideas and services.
Thanks. Perhaps we can turn to the issue of, turn back to the issue of competition, and both how realistic is it to, or how wise, or maybe how inevitable is it that these issues will be dealt with in different ways in different national governments, a little bit as we spoke about with harmful content. And then some of the questions that people are asking about, or one person was saying, you know, to encourage innovation, you need more effective competition. But on the other hand, countries tend to want to pick, or do pick, technological winners. So that's, how do you balance those two interests? And then maybe this is particularly true in the US, but maybe elsewhere, big tech companies have a lot of lobbying power, and how much will that influence what happens to competition legislation? And then one other, maybe you come to this anyway, but there is a view that acquisitions, and you spoke about killer acquisitions and killer zones, Reinhilde. I'm actually going to go back first to Diane, I should let you know that. But is there a sort of feasible policy of ordering, you know, selling up or breakup? Is there any reason to consider, you know, breaking up some of the big companies in order to promote competition? So first to Diane, and you can also comment on you know, the UK system, which is obviously one that you support, and perhaps how you think it will be effective in that way.
So there's a lot in there. Let me start with the point about the acquisitions and breakup. So we might look back now and wish that competition authorities had not let Facebook take over Instagram and WhatsApp, for example. But I'm not an advocate of breakup, not least because it will get the whole issue, you know, enmeshed in courts for years to come, serving nobody particularly well. But it does mean that looking forward, there will be, I think, in every jurisdiction, a lot more scrutiny of proposed acquisitions. And with hindsight, there were signs at the time. So the price paid for Instagram by Facebook was, I think it was $1 billion. It was a small company not making a profit. So you could reasonably ask as a regulator, then what do you think you're paying for in that case? And the other issue is about this interoperability point. We talk about the network effects in economics, and that's what means these are winner-take-all markets. Reinhilde explained it really clearly to start with. And so the scale is actually part of the benefit to the consumers. And that's another reason that you should hesitate to talk about breaking up companies into smaller chunks. But there is sort of technologically engineered network effects as opposed to natural monopoly network effects. And we have seen recently Facebook has been integrating its different messenger systems. If you think about it, SMS, mobile phone calls work on different networks. We can email each other no matter what email client or internet service provider we're using. So actually, I think part of the interesting debate to be had will be about engineering back in more interoperability so that we don't find ourselves in the same position with the next generation of technologies. But the key point is to create the conditions now for new innovation so that just as Facebook knocked MySpace off top perch, it can get knocked off in turn by somebody who comes along with the next fantastic innovation. But these interoperability questions, they're very technical, but they're also incredibly important. And as economists and regulators, we've got to start working with the technical people on that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think it is hard in this area for policymakers to sort of know that there are technical issues, but how do you deal with it? And of course, many of those that understand the technical issues the most are inside the companies. So that can be a problem of regulatory capture and I remember actually when I was working at Google, one of the engineers, a great guy, was saying to me, I just wish that the regulators would tell us, and this was in the context of child protection, and he was saying, I wish the regulators would tell us what the goal is, and then we can figure out how to engineer to achieve that goal. But when we're told how to engineer, you know, it can be very counterproductive. And I think he meant that genuinely. But of course, you don't want to go to the position where you have the regulated telling the regulators how to regulate them. That's a big problem. But I think a focus on goals is also important, as well as this technical standards and understanding issue. And of course, as time goes on, there are going to be more and more technical whizzes who have had their time in private companies and have left and are very interested in addressing public policy issues now. So Reinhilde, do give your take on this issue.
Yeah. So my apologies for the fun of this discussion, but I'm fully aligned to what Diane was saying, what you were saying. So there's no girl fighting here. But so in terms of, first of all, I would like to respond to what you were saying, this importance of how you regulate. That's also what I mean always when I say it should be innovation proof. That means that it should be open, technology neutral, and you should specify in your regulation what your objectives are. It should be goal oriented, but not technology specific. So you should never regulate particular technologies, but really that's the objective I want. And any kind of technology that can serve that objective, that's what you need to regulate here. So I think that's very important to keep regulation open. I also think, like you mentioned too, how important it is that regulators should actually have sufficient technology know-how so that they understand and realize whatever they write down in the regulations, how technology neutral it actually is and how much openness it still leaves for. And that's definitely not obvious here. And particularly like how the GDPR has been written, but also now the Digital Market Act now is very much from what the existing cases are and the existing technology and the existing companies, and it doesn't really design in terms of what future options could be. Partly, I think, because we're lacking the technological competence at the regulatory or competition policy authorities here. And then in terms of breakup, whether I think that's a good idea or not, I am fully aligned with Diane. So the breakup deals with the effect of size, but what's way more important is the incumbency. There is much more danger for negative effects on innovation from incumbency, and that's why interoperability is way more important. Keep making sure that you don't get into that bad dependency, that there is enough modularity and interoperability, particularly with new technological options here. It's way more important than size, and actually size can also be a strong advantage. And if you go for a breakup now, that means that you actually don't allow the size also for new technology options here to be reached if there is a threat of breakup here. So you also have to anticipate those negative effects as well. So rather than focusing on breakup, I would focus much more on making sure that there is no specific incumbency advantage created in your regulatory or competition policy design here, both to protect the current competitors with the incumbents, but also to make sure that you keep enough incentives for the next innovators to become the next big players here. So contestability is way more important than anything else.
Mm-hmm. I think it's, yeah, it's also interesting to think, what does interoperability mean? How much is it about the technical details, and how much is it about sort of broader areas like, and one of the questions that's been raised is about data portability, which is allowed, but actually people don't use it that much. So does that matter? Is it something that, you know, is very important because it will push consumers to go to seek out the best service, or is it not that important because actually people don't want to use it and there's inertia? So I don't know, Reinhilde, if you want to comment on that.
So in that respect, I wanted to add an important point too, is so what interoperability actually entails and what details are important for assuring this interoperability, I think requires again a lot of technological know-how. and that's why I think it's also again related to the effect that you need that competence at the regulatory authorities here, particularly because otherwise you get the interoperability what the incumbents will want, right? Because they have all the incentives to lobby for this. And the only way, and they have the right to do that, but the only way to counter that is make sure that you have enough technological expertise on the other side to trade off optimally what interoperability is needed for efficiency here. So what it is requires getting technological know-how on all sides of the equation.
I think portability is much less important. Right. You can download a PDF of your tweets, and what can you do with that? It's really having APIs with open standards that allow other people to come in and provide services building on whatever data you have.
So it's really starting from the what allows companies and new technological experts and innovators and creators to develop services rather than, and I guess that's quite an interesting point, because my sense is that the push to regulate comes, of course, from citizens, and the response is often about what can individuals do? Can you use your mobile phone across all of Europe without having to pay roaming charges? Or can you get a company to take down some information about you that you don't think is fair? Or can you port your data? And that is very much more on the sort of individual basis, rather than thinking about how to stimulate competition from companies. My impression is that, and perhaps this is true in every sector, that the push on competition and competition policy is maybe, especially in Europe, but maybe not, tends to come from opponents. That's no surprise. You know, the big companies might be fighting with each other, but also incumbents in other industries might be making political arguments to help to enshrine their place. And of course, one big debate, and I would like to turn to this as our last topic, just very briefly, we've got a few minutes left. And you raised this, Diane, I'm going to go to you first, is about the press. And in Australia, there are now new regulations on firms like Google to make platforms pay to publishers and media for content. And is this a great idea, or is this clunky? Is it, you know, how does it fit into an overall view? And I guess one issue that I always think about when we were very concerned, and people are very concerned in the US about the nature of the political debate, but I think that TV channels have been at least as important in polarizing debate and having misinformation, and radio, talk radio, big thing in the US, as much as the internet, but, or maybe, at any rate, they're also an issue, but I think people think about them very differently. So journalism, and as a former journalist like Diane, I certainly am all in favor of supporting journalism, but you know, there's a question about how high quality it is. We all know which major journalistic enterprise has Australian roots. Over to you, Diane.
It's a really important question, and it's pretty clear that advertising revenue has switched from print media to online, and that Google and Facebook dominate online advertising. The Competition and Markets Authority did a fantastic study on this market in detail for the UK, and the information that came out of that is quite staggering, actually. Here we combine it with media regulation, so there's a very different media context than in the United States, although that same media company that you alluded to has had an adverse impact here as well, I think. But it's pretty clear that because of that loss of ad revenue, the ability of other media organizations to invest in journalism has been greatly diminished, and that there's a great cost in terms of the quality and detail in the political debate and the extent to which politicians can be held accountable at national or local level. And I think that's a really serious problem. There are, as well as the Australian version, there's a French version of getting Google and Facebook to pay publishers. I don't know that I think either of them is the right solution, but then does need to be a solution to this. And if Facebook and Google don't like it, then perhaps they can come up with a better proposal themselves.
Thanks, that's a good challenge. And Reinhilde, just we have pretty much 1 minute left, or a little less. You're on mute.
Yeah,
there.
sorry. So here it's a bit more difficult to find the link with innovation, but I still think that, so high quality journalism, for me, that's a public good. And the question is, who is willing to contribute to that? Can you leave it up to the free market to provide that? I think it's definitely needs some kind of government support or public support here in order to ensure that there is high quality journalism. But I think, and also a point that Diane made, is you need to create a fair level playing ground with other media companies as well here. And you have to make sure that if you regulate, that you don't create any distortions in the market here, and that there should be fair competition and everybody should face the same kind of regulatory environment if you serve the same kind of markets here. So in that respect, classic media and social media should, in this case, be regulated on a fair level playing field, I think.
Well, thanks very much. Thank you to terrific panelists, Diane Coyle and Reinhilde Veugelers. I just wanted to let people watching know that, as I think my colleague Nicolas Véran, Senior Fellow at Peterson Institute, remarked, this week is Tech Week at the Peterson Institute, and tomorrow, Wednesday, February 10th, he is having a session looking at tech, but particularly from a financial, fintech and so on point of view. So I urge people to listen into that tomorrow. And thanks very much again. The next Global Connections will be in 1 month's time on March the 9th, where we will talk about the big US-China issues and economic splintering. Thanks very much, Diane, Reinhilde. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.